Interestingly enough, and it was there that I first learned about anti-Semitism, because I never encountered anti-Semitism in Grodno, even though it was a mixed town. I didn't know anything about anti-Semitism. For the first time, some kids tried to get to beat me up on the playground or ice skating rink, and it called me a dirty Jew. I didn't know what in the world happened. I couldn't understand it. Why? Because I didn't know what it was. Well, I learned later. But so we moved to Kovno, and this fellow Nikolai Ivanovich Tomanov, if he really took care of my parents. My mother immediately was an advantage because my parents were Russian speakers from childhood, so there was no trouble getting work with the Soviet army. My mother immediately got a job in the Russian army newspaper, the Red Flag, Krasnaya Znamya. And my father also had a very responsible job at Voyentorg, which is equivalent to you Israelis as us Israelis as Shechem. You know, the same thing as Shechem, but except it was exclusively for the army. And things went really well for us, but we felt anti-Semitism there much more than in other places. And things were changing with the Moscow-Ribbentrop Pact, and the war was always in the offing. And there were big arguments about this. Now this, our friend, the officer, he used to sometimes bring his friends to our apartment. We shared an apartment with a dentist with a huge living room. And they used to discuss politics, things that they couldn't discuss in the army because there were things that weren't supposed to be talked about. You know, you get into big trouble. One thing you couldn't talk about Germany because Russia had a pact with Germany, peace. But I remember we were walking in the street one day, not far from the house, and suddenly this black car, just like in the movies, stops right in front of us. And some soldiers in uniforms that we didn't recognize jump out of the car. They run into an apartment, and a few minutes later they emerge with 3 or 4 people whom they force into the car and drive off. And I was just astounded. I was walking with my father and mother. I said, "What is this?" The father says, "Oh, these are the SS, this is the German police, and they are taking German citizens by force back to Germany." And something clicked in my head. I never forgot that. 2 or 3 days later, all these Russian officers are gathered in our house, and they're having this big argument, you know, about relations with Germany. And these were things you weren't supposed to talk about. You get in big trouble with the powers that be. And they couldn't agree on it. They were just talking and fighting back and forth. And finally, this friend, Nikolai Ivanovich of ours, he picks me up in his arms like that, throws me up in the air almost to the ceiling, catches me back, and he says, my name was in short Yudik, it's Yehuda, it's a Yudik in Polish. He says, "Well, Yudik, who is the enemy of the Soviet Union? What do you say?" And I, without any hesitation, because of that thing in the street, I said, "Germany." And there was a silence. They were all scared. I wasn't supposed to say that. Nobody was supposed to say that. But I said it. And he looked at me and he laughed and he says, "You know what? Maybe you're right." Well, we had family from Grodno. They used to visit us. And in the decisive month of June 1941, I don't know if it means something to you, but it means something to me. That's when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union on 22nd of June. We had visitors, and there began to be rumors that the Germans were massing troops on the border. and one of my grandmothers was there, one of my aunts, and one of my cousins, two of my cousins. My grandmother and an aunt and one of the cousins, also a beautiful girl, Isa, they saw there was trouble and they said they're running back to Grodno. And they went. One, Zhanya Tamar knows who Zhanya is. She was a happy-go-lucky girl, and she wasn't afraid of anything. And she stayed with us. Well, the war broke out. Zhanya survived. They didn't. As simple as that. I think I would say at this point also about what I mentioned before. My other cousin, that taught me how to read, and well, she didn't end well either. There was a big ghetto in Grodno. She was in the ghetto, and everything would have been okay except her boyfriend was in the ghetto too, and they ran away from the ghetto. And the problem is that they were caught and shot in the ghetto, and they let them lie there, the bodies, 3 days. So these are how things happened. However, we in Kovno, before it all started, the Russians saw the Germans were invaded, and all the army families were evacuated, and we were considered to be an army family. And so we got on a train, one of the last trains out of the city and off towards Moscow. And on the way, every day a German plane would fly over and shoot at us and strafe the cars, but we kept on going, and once they caught what they said was a spy aboard, and they took him outside and shot him. But we got to Moscow, and we couldn't enter Moscow. In general, in Russia in those days, you just couldn't enter Moscow. If you were a resident of Moscow, you could be. However, my mother had a sister in Moscow, but my mother wasn't with us. She didn't go on that train. They took her to the army unit of the Red Flag of the Russian newspaper that she worked for, and they went off to the front of the battlefront in Smolensk, and were surrounded by Germans. And she was there. My mother was, by the way, about this tall, and she was there with them. But however, they broke out. Her unit broke out, and she, wearing her army uniform. I never saw her in the army uniform because we weren't there anymore. But she went to Moscow with her army uniform. She went in and she went to see her sister. Her sister is another story. I'm trying not to keep you up till early in the morning, but her sister Lenore was a communist. She lived in the States for a while. In the States she met a Russian spy, and they got married. A Russian spy, any one of you that wants to look it up, when you get home, get on your computer and put in Russian James Bond. And you'll find a fellow by the name of Taras Igorn. That's my uncle. Interesting story. Of course, the Russians did him in the end also, but that's another story in itself. So, you see, we're not getting to any concentration camps yet for ourselves, and we weren't in any concentration camp. We were lucky because of all that.